at the extent to which Julio Claudian Emperors maintained a positive relationship with the Senate. So we're going to be looking at our 5 key Julio Claudian Emperors or princeps, and that would be Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, and Nero. The relationship fluctuates depending on when you're looking and who you're looking at. Augustus, on the whole, can be seen as having a reasonably positive relationship with the Senate. However, you have to consider the extent of his control and dominance over the Senate at that point. Tiberius could be viewed as having a reasonably negative relationship with the Senate, culminating in events such as the treason trials. Gaius, despite a positive start, eventually has a negative relationship with the Senate. Claudius, with his accession, his freedmen, the influence of his wives, you could say there are some negatives there, but equally there are some positives. So we put him as sort of a mixed face. And Nero, again, just like Gaius, despite having a really positive start, ultimately declines and collapses into tyranny. So this question could be asked in multiple ways. You could get asked a question for Julio Claudian Emperor's relationships with the Senate or the elites, where you'd have to talk about the Senate and the equites, the upper classes. And you could also get a question in regard to the level of opposition, where the Senate, again, would be part of that question. So let's look at Augustus to start off with. Augustus does attempt to maintain a positive relationship with the Senate, but you do have to consider the level of control that he has over the Senate after the Battle of Actium in 31, and certainly after his return to Rome after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra. However, there's 3 factors that really influence how Augustus handles the Senate. And these factors are important. First of all, the experience of his adopted father, Julius Caesar. The idea that Caesar's powers and titles and attitude of clementia created resentment against him. So Augustus wants to avoid the fate of Caesar. Secondly, you could also detect in Augustus a certain sense of conservatism. We'll talk shortly about his use of republican precedents that you can certainly see in something like the Resgestae. Finally, you've got a workload issue. Augustus needs the Senate. The Senate, remember, also have provinces to handle as well. He needs their assistance in running this massive empire. So what we're going to look at to start off with is we're going to look at some evidence, and we're going to be looking at sort of official Augustan evidence. So we're going to start off with 2 coins. First coin produced in 28 BC, and really the message of this coin is that Augustus has restored the Republic, i.e. also the influence and the prestige and the dignity of the Senate. So we've got Octavian wearing a laurel wreath here, or obviously the newly christened Augustus. Imperator Caesar, consul of the 6th time. The right-hand side is really quite interesting. You've got Augustus seated on a magistrate chair, wearing a toga, which is a symbol of tradition, and holding a scroll box, and his restoration to the people of their laws and rights. So essentially, this is already talking about his proclamation of the restoration of the Republic and the restoration of the Senate's dignity as early as 28 BC. Fast forward to our second coin, which is in 13 BC. And again, we've got some really interesting things going on here. We've got Augustus here, and seated next to Agrippa, again in togas, symbol of tradition, on a tribune's bench. And this time is the idea that Augustus is not exercising a monopoly on executive power. He shares it in a proper republican manner. Now, this is further corroborated by the Resgestae. The Resgestae, of course, is Augustus's autobiographical discussion of his reign that's made public on his death and then is produced and put onto his mausoleum in Rome. Now, the Resgestae is really, really interesting because obviously it portrays the way that Augustus wanted future generations to look back at his successes, his early career, but also his relationship with the Senate and his restoration of the Republic. And there's various points in Resgestae where Augustus tells us something about his attempts to have a positive relationship with the Senate. So first of all, in verse 5, you've got Augustus refusing to accept powers and titles that aren't really republican. So the dictatorship is offered, he refuses it, obviously trying to avoid a Caesar in terms of a dictatorship that will go on longer than the 6 months. The consulship offered him for the rest of his life. He refuses that in verse 5. Verse 6, he says why he refuses these things, because they are inconsistent with the custom of our ancestors. In verse 12, we've got a reference to the Areopagus, the altar of peace that Augustus is commemorated with by the Senate in 13 BC. So again, this is showing a really positive relationship between Augustus and the Senate, that the fact that they are honouring the peace that Augustus has brought. In verse 34, he talks about his auctoritas influence, and this is important because it contains that phrase, I possess no more official power than others. And then finally, the last verse of the Resgestae, verse 35, when he refers to being given pater patriae by the Senate. So therefore, this is showing the respect of the Senate. We can also talk about the shield that's there's a gift to Augustus given by the Senate and referred to in verse 34. And it talks about his clemency, his justice, his piety. So what we've got here is from the coins and Resgestae is we've got evidence showing that Augustus was certainly trying to cultivate a positive relationship with the Senate. However, this is potentially propaganda. Cassius Dio writes much later. He's writing around 2 centuries later on, Cassius Dio, and certainly that allows him to write much more freely. Dio certainly doubts Augustus's motives. So he says that the Senate, or certainly Augustus's supporters in the Senate, force him, or there's a bit of a charade when Augustus is giving up his power, and he wants to make it seem, or wants to make it look like he's accepting autocratic powers. When this was done, he was eager to establish the monarchy. He wished to be thought democratic. And in regard to the division of provinces, the aim was that the senators should be unarmed for war while he controlled the troops. So Dio is much more skeptical, saying that Augustus was aiming at a monarchy, and certainly Augustus's supporters in the Senate were all trying to sort of create this facade that Augustus was doing this for the sake and for the good of the Republic. Another source that discusses this is Suetonius. Now, Suetonius is much earlier than Dio, well, not much earlier. He's writing under the reign of Emperor Hadrian. And as director of the Imperial Archives, he does have access to Augustus's papers. Again, he's not under obligation to write propaganda. The important thing with Suetonius is that he's actually very positive about Augustus's changes, but in his discussion of them, you can still see the level of control that Augustus has. So first of all, Suetonius likes the fact that the Senate are reduced in number and that characters that undermine the reputation of the Senate are kicked out. So he talks about the Orcus men and the reputation of the Senate being restored. Orcus men is a reference to the senators that had become senators after Caesar's assassination and had taken advantage of that situation. So Suetonius is happy about this, and also the idea that there's now money qualification. There's a reviewed list of senators with Agrippa. Now, this is where it gets really, really quite interesting, is that when Suetonius tells us that Augustus was telling senators of his decision, they actually are searched, and Augustus actually has armor on. They're only allowed to approach him on an individual basis. And what we then get in verse 35 and 36 is the idea of reduced meetings, of the traditions of the Senate being restored, such as wine and incense offerings, but something called a concilium as well, which is a group of advisors that eventually these advisors were supposed to prepare information for the Senate. Eventually, those close advisors are able to pass laws without sort of the Senate's approval. So what we get, if we put Dio and Suetonius together, we've very much got an image reality. The image of the Senate is that it's been restored and its dignity and prestige has been improved. So we've got a reduction of Senate numbers, which Suetonius approves of, money qualification. We've got shortened consulship, so more senators can become consuls, and reduces competition and rivalry in the Senate. Restoration of traditional practices such as wine and incense offerings. However, the reality of the situation is the Senate kind of loses all of its key powers. So Senate committees, in terms of that concilium, the two consuls, 15 senators, and Augustus. The allocation and control of provinces. Augustus controls the imperial frontier provinces with the majority of the legions, whereas the Senate has the older, more stable provinces with fewer legions. Minting of coinage. Augustus gets gold and silver, the Senate bronze and copper. Control over foreign affairs. Pretty much all the Senate can do is meet and greet foreign officials, whereas Augustus can declare war, make peace, etc. And provincial funds as well. Augustus has access to these. His control over the provinces is further enhanced after the second settlement, where his Maius Imperium means that he essentially has control over all of the provinces. Now, we've got some positives about Augustus, but then we've also got some discussions of plots. The information and the detail of the plots is pretty lacking. We've got the Caepio Marina plot, and this all focuses upon a proconsul called Primus who's accused of illegal warfare in 24 BC. He says Augustus gave him permission to conduct this illegal warfare. The reason why this is important is that Macedonia was actually a senatorial province and not an imperial province. So Augustus technically at this point shouldn't have been interfering. Augustus denied it in court. Primus was condemned. And this supposedly launches a plot by two other senators, Caepio and Marina. So Val Marina and Fannius Caepio are executed in 23 or 22 BC. Now, we do have some information about this. So we've got two writers. We've got Vilius, who is a contemporary. He says that Marina and Caepio were villains and suffered the same violent death they had planned for Caesar. So we've got some Senate reaction here. And we've got the far later Macrobus. Hundreds of years later, Macrobus says that Caepio attempted to kill Augustus. So we've got two writers that are corroborating the idea that there was some type of plot against Augustus. Finally, we've also got the Rufus affair. So Ignatius Rufus, the ambitious Equites, technically obviously not a senator, and his institution of a firefighting service, and the idea that he wanted to become consul was certainly challenging Augustus's control and popularity with the plebs. Dio is the one that gives us the vast majority of this information. Vilius also chips in, again, contemporary, so Vilius is earlier than Dio, says that he was more of a gangster than a senator. So what we've got here in the Caepio Marina plot and the Rufus affair is we've got evidence of at least some opposition from the Senate or from the upper classes against Augustus and his control. Let's look at Tiberius. Tiberius certainly has a mixed relationship with the Senate, and that kind of starts from his accession. On his accession speech, Tiberius certainly was trying to show himself as reluctant, and we get all this information from Tacitus. Tiberius wanted to appear chosen by the Senate. Is this following Augustus's supposed feigned reluctance in 27 BC? Is Tiberius genuinely reluctant? Remember, he is in his 50s. He's been sort of exiled previously, or kind of exiled previously, and then come back. He is maybe aware that he wasn't first choice. So does Tiberius genuinely feel reluctant? And certainly Tacitus tells us that he wants to rule with the Senate, but the Senate don't quite believe him, and this leads to friction and tension. And certainly the uncertain accession speech kind of sets the tone for the rest of the relationship throughout Tiberius's reign. So Tacitus, writing much later on, having served and lived under the later Emperor Domitian, has an awareness of certainly what life under a despot or a tyranny is. Obviously, he's pretty scathing of Tiberius for the majority of his account. So there is evidence of him co-ruling with the Senate, or certainly Tiberius attempting to co-rule with the Senate, that's actually in the Tacitus. So he is asked, he asks the Senate of his opinion on a whole range of different issues and topics. He avoids titles like Pater Patriae. We also know that he doesn't want to be deified, and you can get that corroborated by something like the Githyon decree. You've got some generosity to the Senate. However, you do have the Senate and its subservience under Tiberius. Certainly, you could say that Tiberius has a hesitant and his reserved attitude certainly leads to that tension. The best example of that is certainly when the Senate are being asked for their choice of governor to go and deal with the Tacfarinas revolt in Africa. And Tiberius is more than a little bit frustrated that they can't really decide on who to send. And that's because they're certainly fearful of Sejanus, and they're certainly fearful of him. And the idea that maybe Tiberius's cryptic personality, as Tacitus tells us, has that sort of impact on that relationship. We've also got some specific examples of a lawyer who, because he's quite open with his criticism, is never able to attain the consulship. One of the best examples is the historian Cremutius Cordo, who praises Brutus in his history, but then later on his books are burned. In Tacitus, we get quotes like this: Tiberius made a habit of always allowing the consuls the initiative, as though the Republic was still in existence, but the Senate was filled with men who found slavish obedience was the way to succeed politically. So we've got this incredibly contrasting view of Tiberius, maybe wanting to have an equal, almost republican relationship with the Senate, but then equally, the Senate at this point have been so far under the control of one man that obedience is factored into a way of life for the majority of senators. Suetonius gives us some interesting things after this Tacitus quote. Even he, freedom's enemy, became impatient of abject servility, and potentially the Senate's civility is one of those factors that leads to Tiberius retreating to Capri and leaving Sejanus in charge of Rome. Suetonius tells us about his excessive courtesy towards the Senate, asking them for advice, being the servant of the state, entering the Senate unattended, allows the Senate to overrule him and stands up to meet the consuls. But gradually begins to revoke the Senate's decisions and also starts to interfere. Obviously, with Sejanus, we're going to be looking at the treason trials, and then certainly after Sejanus's fall, looking at the murders and the executions after that. Treason trials are portrayed incredibly, obviously, negatively by Tacitus and Suetonius. Are they as brutal? Well, if we look at Tacitus, in 23 years, 52 people charged, with only 12 put to death. Tiberius supposedly dismisses some ridiculous cases. We know that he doesn't consider remarks about himself and his mother as treasonable, but he certainly does against remarks about Augustus. Sejanus, though, plays up to this, and there are executions. Is this essentially Tacitus reflecting on the extreme fear of the upper classes? The upper classes concerned about the delatores, the informers, and also the influence of Sejanus. Now, whilst Tacitus and Suetonius, or certainly Tacitus, really describes Tiberius very negatively, certainly Suetonius does that in large chunks of his biography, we do have one positive source, and that positive source is Vilius, again, who is a senator at this point. Now, Vilius does discuss a range of positives about Tiberius's reign. So, for instance, he talks about how political conspiracy had been eliminated, how the magistrates and the Senate had their authority and majesty restored. No riots, provinces free from extortion. Interestingly, on the Sejanus point, Laius argues that just as Augustus had used Agrippa in the same sort of Batman and Robin combo, Tiberius also had Sejanus. He also discusses Germanicus, story for another time, and talks about how he saved senators from poverty. So Vilius is an interesting counter to Tiberius and Suetonius. However, you must take into account the idea that Vilius disappears, possibly during the treason trials. Let's look at Gaius. Gaius has a really positive start, but then turns really quite negative and quite toxic in his relationship with the Senate. Suetonius, again, gives us some great information about the positive start. The reason why Gaius is benefiting from such a positive reception is because he is the son of Germanicus, exceptionally popular, but also because he's not Tiberius. So the Romans, overjoyed they find his accession a dream come true. The Senate confer absolute power on him. They ignore Tiberius's will. Despite the positive start, Gaius's reign quickly turns to tyranny after his illness. And we get quotes like this: "Let them hate me as long as they fear me." So why does this change happen, or how does it reflect his relationship with the Senate? Well, in verse 30 of Suetonius, we get the idea that he's abused the Senate as supporters of Sejanus or informers against his family. Remember, two brothers and his mum were all murdered by Sejanus, or certainly agents of Sejanus, potentially with the Senate's knowledge. Gaius also maintained Tiberius was justified in his cruelty and the idea that he deprived the noblest men of their family emblems. There is the story of the horse and whether Gaius was actually intending on naming his horse consul. Do you remember that could be a put down or a joke where he's almost saying, well, my horse could do a job of a consul, or my horse could do a job of a senator. And then that has come down to Suetonius as an actual thing that Gaius said. We do get other sources that corroborate Suetonius's view of Gaius having a negative relationship with the Senate. And those sources are, again, quite contemporary or near contemporary. So Suetonius writes much later, but certainly Josephus is a little bit earlier. Josephus, who is writing under the Flavian emperors, and he certainly talks about Gaius's madness having an impact on his relationship with the Senate in terms of his attacks on the Senate. He plundered and laid waste to Rome's citizens, in particular the Senate, and those of its members who were patricians or highly respected for distinguished ancestry. The motive for such executions was usually in order to seize their possessions. Seneca, writing even earlier than Josephus, writes on anger. Now, remember, Seneca is tutor to Emperor Nero, and there's a good chance that what he's writing is to instruct Nero about how to behave as a good princeps. On anger, he talks about how senators are flogged and tortured, and talks about how Gaius considered butchering the whole Senate. The one final thing to consider with Gaius is obviously his assassination, where he's assassinated by a number of praetorians and also maybe some senators who have a knowledge of this. The important thing that we get from Josephus is the reaction of the people after the assassination, and this is where the Senate or members of the Senate want to restore the Republic, whereas the people don't want the Senate back. And again, this is great because it highlights a little bit of that conflict between what the Senate are really thinking and how they're behaving towards these emperors. The people, on the other hand, have no love for the Senate and realize that the emperors acted as a curb for its rapacity and were a source of protection for themselves. Whereas the Senate, who obviously lose this argument, are wanting to bring back the Republic. So it does show you that those tensions are just underneath the surface. Claudius, you could say, has a positive and negative relationship with the Senate. Certainly, the way that he becomes emperor and gains power has a negative impact on the relationship with the Senate. The fact that he essentially buys, as Suetonius says, the throne by bribing the praetorians. So what have we got? Well, for positives, he certainly refuses titles. Annuls Gaius' edicts, so Suetonius and Tacitus tells us there's a general amnesty after the assassination of Gaius, so only the actual murderers are punished. There's an amnesty for anyone else. No exiles without permission, minting of bronze coinage to the Senate, and softer measures to remove senators. On the negative, though, Claudius' behavior as a judge in Tacitus is actually quite negative, and also Tacitus maintains that 35 senators and 300 equites are executed. One of the best examples of the tension between Claudius and the Senate is his attitude towards the Senate expansion. Prior to that, Suetonius is actually reasonably positive towards Claudius, and his relationship with the Senate. So in his Claudius 12, we've got the idea that he refuses imperator, he's respectful, he even asks permission for leave, and respectful towards the tribunes. There are some plots and conspiracies, equites, 2 senators as well, and an attempted coup. And as a judge and a consul, he's consul 5 times, but also throughout his life, also as a judge, he's conscientious but could be severe. So some reasonable positives here. Tacitus gives us discussion and the debate in the Senate when Claudius wants to expand the Senate to include Gallic Romans. The Senate are completely against this because they don't want the Senate to be cheapened by descendants of people that had fought against Caesar. Claudius, though, according to Tacitus, uses his excellent historical knowledge and his scholarly background to argue that Rome had always acted to bring in excellence from other areas and that Rome had assimilated other peoples. And basically, the exclusivity and the exclusiveness of citizenship in Athens and Sparta wasn't to be repeated if Rome was to be a success. So essentially, Claudius uses Roman history to supposedly beat this argument, beat this senatorial opposition to improve and to expand the Senate to include these Gallic groups. The big issue with Claudius is his use of freedmen, though. Why does Claudius use freedmen, and why do those freedmen gain such prestige and such influence? Well, there's a number of possible answers to this. First of all, is it the Senate's actual hostility towards Claudius? The idea that how he gained power and the idea that they're kind of anti-Claudius anyway, don't really like him. Remember, he has spent a lifetime. Even Suetonius quotes Augustus' letters where he's not particularly complimentary about Claudius. Is it the Senate's ineffectiveness as a partner in government? We've already seen Tiberius use Sejanus because the Senate is so ineffective. Claudius, though, wants to use the speciality and the knowledge of these freedmen, people like Pallas and Narcissus. However, is it because Claudius is still trying to play the princeps role of being an equal with the Senate? Because he has such respect for the Senate, he doesn't feel he can ask noble senators to serve in a civil service. We've also got the issue of the imperial cult, where Claudius can't use senators in the running of the imperial cult. Otherwise, it would undermine the whole idea of the modus operandi of the Principe, which is primus inter pares, first amongst equals. In the discussions from Tacitus and Suetonius, though, they're really negative about Claudius's use of freedmen and their wives. But naturally they would do because they're writing from a senatorial point of view and from a pro-senator perspective. Suetonius says this about Claudius's use of freedmen. He was manipulated by his wives and freedmen and was more of a servant than an emperor. And again, this is where we get our information about a grand total of 35 senators and 300 equites executed with little concern. Nero, just like Gaius, has a positive start, then quickly drops into tyranny. What we get in Suetonius is we get some really positives. I've called Nero a Roman two-face here. Remember, we have the 5 golden years of the first part of Nero's reign, where he's under the influence of Seneca and Borus. His reign begins really positively. In Suetonius, he's going to model his rule on the principles laid by Augustus, aids impoverished senators, and doesn't want excessive honours being given to him. He gives a monthly grain ration to the people, and is incredibly generous as well. But we have the murders as well. So obviously we have Agrippina and maybe Nero's knowledge of what was happening in terms of Claudius's murder. This is an image of Nero and the infamous poisoner of Rome, Locusta. We've got the actual murder of Britannicus at a banquet. And then we've got Nero's murder of his own mother as well. So these discussions in Suetonius and in Tacitus certainly allow us to see that despite that positive start, there is tensions bubbling underneath the surface once more. Why would senators plot against Nero? Well, again, his criminal record, some attacks on the Senate's rights, his cruelty and his debauchery, draining of the treasury, particularly after the Great Fire of Rome, and property confiscations, again, in order to fund buildings such as the Golden House. This is an image of Razia, who's just been instructed to commit suicide. Razia is a really interesting senator who is massively opposed to really the excesses of Nero's reign. Certainly when the Senate are informed of Agrippina's murder, we're told that Razia gets up and walks out. The key discussion for any information about Nero and his relationship with the Senate has to be the Piezo Plot. The Piezo Plot is a plot of over 40 senators involved in an assassination attempt of Nero, centered around Gaius Calpurnius Piso, an aristocrat with a republican pedigree. Now, these senators, and also this involves members of the Praetorian Guard as well, have a number of options. The first option is, do they kill Nero when he goes to Piso's for dinner unarmed, and Piso is completely against that. The other option is to honorably assassinate Nero at the games, in more of a Brutus and Cassius assassination of Caesar way, that if it's now in public and open, it's honorable. Obviously, the plot completely fails, and it fails when a slave called Milicus is asked to sharpen a knife for these games, and instead goes and informs Nero's agents. When the senators are brought together for questioning, their accounts don't match up, and this quickly creates a mass arrest and execution of senators and those associated with the supposedly guilty senators in Rome. We get some great quotes on the aftermath, particularly from our writers. After the massacre of so many distinguished men, Nero coveted the destruction of virtue herself by killing Razia. Men who'd lost their sons or brothers thanked the gods and fell before Nero. And we get an idea of the sycophancy of the Senate here. Despite Nero hinting that he would one day wipe out the entire senatorial order, there's abundant congratulation, especially from those with most to lament in the Senate. Does this show the fear of the Senate towards Nero? It's no surprise that we soon get those rebellions and revolts against Nero, and eventually Nero being declared a public enemy and being forced to commit suicide. So how do we answer a question? What's an essay plan for this question look like? Well, first of all, we might want to talk about Caesar's assassination, just very briefly, and the idea that the Senate must be respected in order to avoid a similar fate. For Augustus, we're going to need to talk about his aim, his image and reality issue in terms of the Senate, some of his senatorial reforms, and certainly the plots against him. And for sources, we can use Suetonius, Resgestae and the coinage, Cassius Dio, and Vilius. For Tiberius, we're going to talk about that awkward accession speech, his frustrations with the Senate, his use of Sejanus, the treason trials, and his retreat to Capri using Tacitus Suetonius. Vilius is really important to give us that counter argument to Tacitus and Suetonius. For Gaius, we can talk about the positive start and that initial popularity, but then the inevitable dip into cruelty, using some great writers such as obviously Suetonius, but Josephus and Seneca were much closer to the action. Claudius, again, we can talk about his accession and how that might have given sort of a negative start in terms of relationship with the Senate, the expansion of the Senate debate, but then the negativity of the relationship with the freedmen and wives, and we can use Tacitus and Suetonius for that. Finally, with Nero, we can talk about the positive start, the criminal record, the opposition of Razia, very importantly is the Piezo Plot, and then the revolts and the suicide using Tacitus and Suetonius. Another type of question could look at opposition towards the emperors, in which case we'd look a little bit like that, looking at Augustus, the Caepio Marina and the Rufus affairs, Tiberius, the opposition of Agrippina and the Sejanus attempted coup, and then the treason trials reaction. For Caligula, you could look at the assassination plot and in particular use Josephus really effectively there. Claudius, a little bit less on there in terms of Silius and the bigamous marriage with Messalina. And for Nero, you could talk about the opposition of Razia, but again, the Piezo Plot and those revolts.